You're listening to the Pink Tax Podcast, where being a woman costs more and we've got the receipts. From overpriced razors to underpaid roles, we're talking money, power, and the price of showing up. Let's get into it. Hey everybody, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Pink Tax Podcast. I'm your host, Janine Rogan. I'm a financial educator, and I have been in this space for 14 years, which is insane. This week, I'm really excited to dive into what we can actually do to close the wage gap, because this is something that I have been so passionate about for so long. I have written a book about it. I have dedicated my life's work to figuring out how we close this wage gap, and I wanted to dedicate a podcast episode to this because I think it's so important. But if you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, I have a great idea for a podcast episode, or I know a really incredible guest, I would love to hear from you. You can always email me at hello@janinerogan.com and tell me what you think we should talk about on the podcast in 2026, because I'm just getting started and I'm so excited for this podcast and all of the positive feedback we've had so far. So let's dive right in. So this year in 2025, for the first time ever, the wage gap in the US actually increased, which is not great. Let's be honest. There has been such a pushback with DE&I this year. You've heard me talk about it with a couple of guests in previous episodes, with Amy Deal and with Sarah Kaplan, on what we actually need to do and how we actually navigate this, because it is having an impact on Canada. And while I am Canadian, I obviously understand that we live in a global world and this impacts all of us. And I hate that the wage gap has gotten bigger. It really is disheartening. So I'm a big statistics person. I love data. You can tell that I love data as much as I do if you take a look in my book. There are over 200 sources for my book, and I really am proud of the fact that we have all of the data backing up our arguments, because I do think it's important. I'm also 3/4 of the way through my master's in economics, and I really feel like data is important when it comes to validating your argument. But I pulled some Canadian statistics because this is something, again, that I think is really important. Okay, so per Statistics Canada, the median hourly wage for full-time employees aged 25 to 54 in 2024, this is 2024 data, the kind of ratio of women's earnings per every $1 a man earns for hourly wages in Canada was 90 cents. So that's a 10% wage gap. The average, so average is different than median. The average hourly wage of all employees over the age of 15, the ratio is sitting at about 88 cents. So a 12% wage gap. And then when we take into account average annual wages, salaries, and commissions for all occupations, the wage gap is about 71 cents. And I will also say that we have to remember that this is usually comparing white women to white men. We know the wage gap just gets bigger as soon as we add any level of intersectionality. So whether you're a woman of color or a member of the LGBTQ2S+ community, or if you're neurodivergent or you're not able-bodied, these are all things, plus so many others, that impact the wage gap as well. So keep that in mind as we're going through these statistics. I think it's important that we call this out, because I think we also need to start collecting more data around marginalization and how that actually also impacts the wage gap. So I just wanted to note that. So according to the OECD, for full-time employees, there's a 17% difference between annual median earnings for women and men. For self-employed people, this jumps to 28%. So in ranking all of the countries around the world for full-time employees, Canada has the 7th worst gender pay gap. And the OECD is saying it'll take 169 years to close the economic gender gap. So I know I'm starting out with doom and gloom, and I'm sorry, but that's where we stand right now. And I think it's important to set the level, it's important to level the playing field and understand where we're starting from so that we can actually kind of do better. Once we know better, we can do better. That's Maya Angelou. But kind of there's so many different areas and conversations around the wage gap. It's like it's really hard to understand kind of where we should be listening to the data and where we actually need to take action. So CanadianWomen.org says that women make 84 cents on the dollar. Indigenous women earn 26% less than their Indigenous male counterparts. And I just think like there's so many statistics out there around the fact that, especially in Canada and the US, people of color or Indigenous people, they're marginalized and they just make so much less. So there are a lot of things we can do. But I think, again, it's really important to understand the wage gap, because once we understand the wage gap, we understand how it compounds in just how expensive it is to be a woman. And then that translates into the wealth gap. We know white women hold only 30% of the worldwide wealth, and women of color hold just 2%. So there is room for improvement, that's for sure. But when we look at the wage gap, I think there's a lot of different things we can do, and I will get into those, I promise. But I think one of the arguments I always hear is like, the wage gap has been debunked. And like, I usually get that, unfortunately, in the like worst comment sections on TikTok and YouTube. And it's usually all men. And there are a couple of things I want to touch on here that I think are really important. So men will always be like, if we adjust for, what kind of work people do, then the wage gap disappears. And I think there's two important things there. Is, they always say like the oil fields, especially because I live in Alberta, and like construction, like that is like harder work. And I'm not here to say like that is not hard and challenging work, but I would argue like a nurse is working just as hard and actually saving people's lives. So I think there's a conversation here that needs to happen around equal pay for equal work of value, because in our society, we have decided that jobs that men hold predominantly are more valuable. There always is room in the budget, whether you live in a city or a province or a state, for firefighters and police officers to get raises. And there never seems to be budget for teachers or nurses. And I think what Alberta just went through this fall with the teacher strike is a perfect example. And I think anyone who had a child in the pandemic knows that teachers should be paid at least $1 million an hour or a day to take care of and educate our young people, because anyone who had to do it during that pandemic knows exactly how much work it is and how hard it was to have your kids at home and try and teach them school and work full time. It's impossible. And so I think there is a conversation here around equal pay for equal work of value, and that is really, really important. But the other piece I'll say to that is like, when women tend to start to dominate an industry, their pay goes down. And I'll give you 3 examples of that. So the movie Hidden Figures, if you haven't watched it, you definitely need to, because it's such a good movie. But it really shows that when we were trying to put man on the moon, the original kind of computers, or now we would call them software engineers, were Black women. And they were doing all of the math calculations behind the scenes. And they were not very well respected. They were not paid very well. And if we fast forward, not even 100 years, when we look at software engineers in Silicon Valley, they're predominantly men, usually white men, and they're paid extremely well. I used to work at a tech company, and it's like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And while what they're doing is complicated and requires a lot of training, is it more valuable than a nurse who's like saving someone's life? Or I would argue no. And I haven't read it yet, but it's on my list. I want to read the book Bullshit Jobs, because I think, this really speaks to it. And I can't remember who posted it, but there was a timeline or a graph of people who actually thought that their work was meaningful and their pay, and whether or not men or women dominated it. And it's like, yeah, like librarians and teachers and nurses and all of the areas and caretakers that are predominantly women definitely are paid less, and they actually view their work as valuable. And then on the other side, it's like, no offense to accountants, because I'm an accountant, but like accountants, lawyers, like software engineers, management consultants, like I think everyone knows deep down, like that work is not that it's not important, but it's not as valuable to our society as literally like nurses and doctors and people. I don't know, maybe I'll get in trouble for this, but people literally saving lives. And I think software engineers is a perfect example. School teachers 100 years ago were predominantly men, and they were kind of well paid and well respected in society. And now, predominantly women. And I think this follows a perfect example in Alberta of just how much we don't value our teachers and forcing them back to work and stripping their rights away and not giving them raises for 10 years in Alberta, I think just speaks volumes to how much we do not value teachers. And I think that people will usually, I sometimes find myself in the comment section on Facebook, which is a very, 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 very bad place to be. But they'll say like, oh, I could do their job because I, got through that grade. And it's like, I've been on so many planes, but I do not pretend to think that I know how to fly a plane. And there is like a very specific way that you have to teach, and you literally go to school for that. So I think just because you passed grade 1 doesn't mean you could teach it. And I think we really need to remember that as a society. But the last kind of example of this is in pediatrics. We have seen more women kind of going into the field of pediatrics, and it is now the lowest paid medical field for doctors. And it's really sad. And these are called pink collar jobs, but it is really sad to see as women move in and out of different career choices and start to dominate those areas, the pay goes down and the respect in society goes down. And women actually dominate graduates from university. And yet, in the tech space, for example, less than 30% of women actually hold those roles. And, when we look at kind of the C-suite and the board level of some of these companies, it is usually like 5 dudes sitting around a table. Maybe there's one woman who's running HR. And I think that also speaks to something else, is that the wage gap isn't just, comparing 2 identical jobs and saying one is paid more, one is paid less. It's everything in how we promote, in how we move people up in our companies. And I do really think that has a long-term impact, because when the CEO and the CFO are the 2 top paid positions and they're always male, yeah, that's not equal. And there are absolutely qualified women that could run those companies and could be the CFOs and the CEOs of those companies. We just have to do a better job of finding them and get away from our biases to hire people that look like us. And I know I talked about meritocracy with Sarah Kaplan. If you haven't listened to that episode, it's definitely worth a listen. She's incredible. I just really, really think that we do need to take a critical look at our companies. And this is where quotas come in. And I think quotas are a really important part of closing the wage gap. And people will probably come at me being like, I don't want to be a quota hire. And it's like, when we actually look at who is being brought in for interviews, and I was part of an interview group once, and they literally brought us, I think, 4, like the recruiter brought like 4 dudes. And I was like, where are the women? They're, oh, well, none applied. And I'm like, then go find them. That's literally your job. And I think the recruiter I said it nicer than that, but I think they were surprised. But if we don't question these things, we're never going to see change, because it's like, oh, well, no one applied. So we just went with the candidates that we had. And it's like, okay, well, we also know that men apply for jobs when they're only 60% qualified, and women wait till they're 100% qualified. So let's like put our critical thinking caps on and find people. Because you can't tell me in a country where there's, I think we're at 38 million people, or in the US there's 330 plus million, that there isn't one qualified woman. You cannot tell me that is not the case. And so I think, when we talk about the wage gap and when we're dispelling the myths of the wage gap, that is one thing to remember, is like as women move into roles, they start to be taken less seriously in society and they're paid less. The other piece of it, when it comes to the wage gap, is around salary transparency. And I'm so excited that Ontario just announced as of January 1st, 2026, they're going to be rolling out some new legislation. And I talked about it in my newsletter this week, the week that I'm recording this. And I don't think this episode will go live for a couple of weeks. But if you're not on my newsletter list, you definitely want to be. I will leave a link in the show notes to that. But we have to start posting salary transparency. And we have to start posting those ranges, because when you're basing it off of kind of what someone made in a previous job, if they were underpaid in that job, then they're going to be underpaid in this job. And it's like that kind of floor of where you start becomes the basis for all of your raises after that. So I'm so happy that they're finally legislating that we have to have ranges for jobs. And the range can't be more than $50,000 unless you make over $200,000. I don't know if that's the best metric. I would say like plus or minus 10% of the midpoint, because I think 50,000 is quite large for someone making $60,000. So I would rather see like plus or minus 10% of the midpoint, and it would apply to all jobs, because then kind of like as you make more money, the range can get a little bit wider. But it is a good step in the right direction. And I think that there will be positive things that come out of this. My hope is that other provinces, Alberta, start to follow suit. I'm not sure if they will, but I don't know. I hope, because there's pressure from other provinces, because BC also has some legislation around this. We've seen it successful in Colorado as well as Denmark. We see it in Denmark, pardon me. But I think when we start to see this change, it is really important. And there's other things that go along with this legislation, like employers have to get back to you within 45 days of the final interview. They have to say if this is actually a job that they're hiring for, or if they're replacing someone, or if it's a vacant position, because we've all been there where we apply for a job, crickets, we hear nothing. We see that job reposted and reposted and reposted and reposted. And in many cases, I think employers are just looking to collect information around kind of what the candidate pool is, and that's not okay. They also have to include whether or not they're using AI, which I think is great as well, because yeah, when there are thousands of applications, I mean, you kind of have to use AI to sift through some of the resumes, but at the same time, if our AI is biased in how it's been trained and the data it's been trained on has been biased, and Amazon actually, I think, ended up in a lawsuit about this. They trained their data for recruiting on their current workforce, and their current workforce was skewed to specific schools, predominantly white men, and yeah, then it really started to spit out candidates that were, again, kind of exactly what you would expect, biased in the sense that they looked exactly and were from the same schools as the current labor force. And so I think, those are all positive things. And I think we definitely have to make sure that they're implemented in ways that are impactful to people, because I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit jaded, but as I've gone through my life, I don't know if many companies will do the right thing out of the goodness of their heart. I think usually it comes down to legislation. There are definitely companies that are leading the charge, but I would say the vast majority kind of just go with what is like legally required of them. So I think that, that is really important to closing the wage gap. And I think that I'm hopeful in 2026 that this creates change in Canada for other provinces and other companies to include these ranges, because I think especially if you have like a national workforce, you have to post it in Ontario, and so hopefully they'll just start to include it in all of their roles that they're posting on their website. So these are really good policy changes, and I have to credit Allison, who is going to be on the podcast later this season, from This Is Moms at Work, who has been advocating for these impactful and important changes. So Allison, if you're listening, kudos to you. I'm so proud of you. And I think the work that you're doing is so, so important. So definitely give her a follow if you have not checked her out. She is doing such good things in Canada. And I love that I get to chat with her sometimes. And We get to collaborate on podcasts and all of the good things. But I think, there's other things we can do to close the wage gap. Absolutely. Absolutely. These policy changes are good. I would love to see, in terms of policy, mandated reporting. But I think that there also has to be an accountability piece, because we see in the UK that there is reporting requirements around wage gaps, but if the wage gap is there, they don't really have to do anything about it. And so I think that there has to be movement. There has to be companies and countries saying, like, we want to close this wage gap. We think that it's not fair. Because when you look at some of those companies, and I have definitely looked at the data, you'll see like a range within a pay band, and like the bottom quartile is predominantly women and the top quartile is predominantly men. So we know that it still exists. And I think the other thing is, I worked at a company once where you have kind of different internal levels. Most places do. It'll be like associate, senior associate, etc. And manager, whatever your internal levels are. And there's usually like P1, P2, or whatever. And when you have people kind of doing similar work, regardless of their title, and all of the men are at one level and all of the women are at a lower level, I think that also perpetuates the wage gap, because their bonuses are going to be higher. Their movement within their band is going to be higher, like literally, especially if they're doing the same job. If you can't really showcase how their jobs are different, it's just like, this is the level you were hired at. And I saw that a lot. I think we have to have, again, put our critical thinking caps on and be like, hey, there are 10 people on this team. 5 are men, 5 are women, and all 5 are at the higher level. Why is that? And again, it's not that the men should be paid less. It's that we should lift the women up to be paid for the work that they're doing. So I think if you're a manager listening to this, definitely look within your organization about what is happening, where your people fall, and don't just look kind of like within one pay group. I would also say, like, are these people doing similar work, and should we be looking to promote someone kind of to that next level so that they're within that pay band? But, when we look at what we can actually do as employees, the number one thing we can do is negotiate. And I think that can be hard for women because we're seen in a negative light. And I think we're called a lot of words. I've been called all of the words, bitchy, pissy. I've been called most of those, aggressive. And those are all bad words when you're a woman. You were whining, been called that before. But then when men advocate for themselves, that's not the case. But what we do know is when women advocate on behalf of other women, they're just as successful as their male counterparts. And if you're wondering, how do I negotiate without kind of coming across or being perceived that way, which it absolutely shouldn't fall on women, and I hate that it does, but you should definitely go back and watch the episode that I recorded with Fotini at the beginning of this season, because that is jam-packed with negotiation knowledge. But the other thing I think we need to talk about our wages more. Walk into any room, and I don't think people, specifically women, like to talk about money. I feel like I would love to literally walk into every room and be like, how much money do you make? And it not be a thing. Because for some reason we've been told, like, well, you don't want to say that you're making too much because then you're greedy. But if you're not making very, very much and your partner is successful, then you're a gold digger. And it's like, we have to throw out those gender norms. We have to throw that all out. And I think we should just be open and honest, because had a man I was working with not told me what he was making, I never would have known that I was training him. And I was being paid $13,000 less than he was. And I've shared this story before, but I was so mad. And I was so upset that they would hire this guy to be trained by me and not look at our salaries and say, like, we should probably give her a raise. Because again, it's not about taking other people down. It's about lifting up those that are underpaid or not being paid kind of the value that another person in the organization is being paid. And so because of him, I was actually able to negotiate $15,000. So I was being paid more than he was, which thank goodness. And thank goodness we had leaders that saw the value in that. But I don't think it should have gotten to that. I think when you're hiring someone into your organization, you should absolutely be looking at what the other people are making and adjust. If you need to adjust, you have to adjust. That is part of running a business. And I think for the men listening, if there are any men listening, you absolutely need to share what you're making with your female counterparts. And I think for the white women listening, you absolutely need to share with the women of color what you're making, because we know that there's a wage gap even just within different groups of women. And with more information, again, when we know better, we do better. And knowledge is power. And so having that information is so crucially important. So if you take one thing away, go talk to one of your friends about what they make, because I think if we start to normalize this, I think this will help us in closing the wage gap. The other thing I think that companies can do is around childcare, and the government can also do better on childcare. We are trying to roll out $10 a day daycare. I don't think we're there yet in many provinces. We're definitely not there in Alberta. And right now, I think we're still negotiating with the feds on this, but affordable, accessible childcare is crucial to closing the wage gap, because we see women exit the workforce when this happens. And right now in Alberta, we have a blanket $326 a month for childcare for kids, under the age of 6. I think school-age children pay a lot, or their parents pay a lot for after-school care. So we need to address both of those things. But even still, $326 can be a lot for people that are living paycheck to paycheck. It's better than it was when I started with the daycare we're at. It was $1,600 for my infant to go. So we've come a long way, and there's still work to do. Especially, I'm not sure if she listens to this podcast, but there's a gal I went to high school with who had quadruplets, spontaneous quadruplets. And it's like, oh my God, her daycare bill, because she has 5 kids, is over $1,000 a month. And that's a lot for a lot of people. So to me, it should be free. And I don't know why, as government agencies, we're not give all of the tax breaks to companies that put on-site daycare. You want people back in the office? Put a daycare on site. You want a tax break for that? Absolutely. 100%. Make that daycare free. Make it for the employees of your company and make it on site. Take that on as an expense. What an incredible return on investment, because when mom can pop down to breastfeed, she is probably more likely to come back before that 18-month mark. If mom is able to pop down when the kid is sick and take them home, again, so much more likely to come into the office. I can tell you, we chose our daycare based on the location of where we live and work. And I think most people try to. So put daycares on site. My God, make it free. And we also have to critically look at daycare deserts, because we shouldn't have people commuting 40 minutes to get to childcare in a city where we can definitely afford it. Oh, we absolutely have to mandate shared parental leave. I know men get 5 weeks. I don't think that's enough. I think that they should be doing at least minimum 3 months, and it should be use it or lose it from the government. And you don't get to transfer it to a different partner. You have to take that time. And I think as leaders in our companies, we have the unique opportunity, and this happened to me a few years ago, to stop asking if men are taking parental leave, but asking how much parental leave they're taking. Because I think when we flip the question on its head, we end up in a place where we are telling men, we expect you to take time off and go be with your family and help raise this child that you created. And I think once men get involved in just how much work it is to run the household and do all the things for the kid, I think they start to see just how chaotic being a parent is. And I'm not saying that there aren't dads that are involved, but when men take parental leave, I think it really opens their eyes to what is actually going on, and the injustices and inequities that women face. And then also companies stop being like, oh, if I'm going to promote someone or if I'm going to hire someone, subconsciously, maybe my bias is kicking in, oh, she's kind of childbearing age. We're thinking, okay, well, both parents are probably going to take leave, so it doesn't matter. And that, I think, also starts to close the wage gap. I was passed over for promotion 3 times: when I was pregnant, when I was on mat leave, and when I came back from mat leave. And when those things start to happen, we start to see kind of the wage gap just get bigger. So we also have to stop doing that. Please promote your women on mat leave. It's a good look. It's a really good look for 2026. And last thing that I'll say here on closing the wage gap, because I think I've given lots of ideas. And if you have any more, I want to hear from you. So leave them in the comments on Spotify, DM me. You can follow us on Instagram at Pink Tax Show. But one of the things I think that's so important is increasing minimum wage. In Alberta, we have the lowest minimum wage in Canada at $15 an hour. It has not been increased. Oh God, is it 8 years, 6 years, or 8 years? I can't remember off the top of my head. Probably eight. Rachel Notley was the last leader to increase it. And we are supposed to be like the richest province, and we have the lowest minimum wage, and 60% of minimum wage workers are women. And I think that, again, kind of speaks to my initial point around care work. We undervalue care work in our society. So the last point I'll make here is around minimum wage. We know that 60% of minimum wage workers are women. And we know that oftentimes women have to take part-time roles because, unfortunately, the burden of childcare or elder care gets placed on women and running the household. And I think when we do that, we do a disservice to women, and we haven't increased minimum wage, at least in Alberta, in a very long time. It was last increased with Rachel Notley. And so Alberta has the lowest minimum wage in all of Canada, and we're supposed to be the richest province. And that's really disheartening because we know that increasing minimum wage does not cause inflation, because in Alberta, we didn't increase minimum wage all through the pandemic and we still had incredible inflation. So we know that's not the case. And we know that keeping minimum wage low hurts women, and increasing minimum wage only helps them. Giving people in the lowest income earning brackets more money only allows them to provide food for their kids and shelter and not have to make a choice between putting food on the table and paying their electricity bill, which I think we have to decide as a society that that's valuable. Not having people stress the point of not being able to afford their basic needs is important. And I end up on TikTok in these, not arguments, but in my comment section, when I talk about this stuff, there's always people that are just like, work harder. I worked hard. I was close to homelessness, and then I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. And it's like, that's great, Karen, but it's not the same anymore. And you have to take into account that, like, I'm so glad that you were able to do that, but not everyone is able to do that. And when we put safeguards in our society, like minimum wage, which was created so that people literally couldn't exploit workers and children, when we put those safeguards in place, we lift everyone up. And, you know, without getting too far down the rabbit hole of like what we decide should be just basic human rights, I think putting a roof over someone's head and having food, we should just agree as a society that, like, yeah, you know what, those things are valuable. And we shouldn't have people starving or children starving. And I guarantee you those parents are working as hard as they possibly could. But if you're working 40 hours a week and earning minimum wage and you're not able to afford your basic needs, I think something is fundamentally wrong with our society. And so we need to change that. We need to advocate for higher minimum wage. And if that means other people's wages go up too, then so be it. We have been through a time of incredible inflation, and I think companies have benefited from being able to raise their prices. I'm looking at you, Loblaws. And because of that, they've had incredible profits, but they haven't had the increased costs. Like, if I wonder, I'm going to do this as an exercise, but if we go back on a publicly traded company kind of pre-pandemic and look at their, you know, gross profit or their profit for the year, and we look at the percentage of employee salaries versus revenue, what that looks like from like 2019 to now, because I would venture to guess that many of these companies, while they have had increased costs, have not increased their salaries to the extent that they have been able to increase their prices. So I think we can do better there as well. So that's it for me on this week's episode. I think, you know, there's lots of things we can do to start closing the wage gap. The number one thing, though, I would say is start talking about it, right? Start talking about it with your friends, with your coworkers. and have conversations around money and what people are making, because when you don't know, it's really hard to advocate for that. So I'm hopeful that some of this legislation in Canada is going to be a positive thing. And I think there is a lot more work we can do. So thanks for tuning into this week's episode of The Pink Tax, and I will see you next week. And that's a wrap on this week's episode of The Pink Tax. Thank you for joining me on the front lines of financial fairness. Remember, understanding the cost of being a woman is just the start. Now it's time to demand your worth and build your wealth. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a step in dismantling systemic inequality and securing your financial future. If this episode sparked a fire in you, take a screenshot, tag us on social media, and share it with a friend who needs to join the movement. Until next time, keep your wallet guarded, your eyes open, and let's keep fighting for a world where pink is just a color, not a tax bracket.